somewhere in Dreamland.
It looked like the complexion of a dead person in a casket.
Random memories of waking up in the night, knowing I'm not alone in the room.
We have 3 cities that all claim to be the UFO capital of the entire world.
So when she turned on the kid's light, it stopped walking.
My parents told me these things didn't exist.
They're a little more ominous, creepy, scary, and the question is there, what is this thing?
Hovering just inches from the window was literally is what you'd imagine a grave to be.
Never seen anything like this in my life.
I'm still left with more questions than answers.
Welcome back, dreamers. If you've had an encounter, please contact me at somedreamland@gmail.com, find me on social media at somedreamland podcast, or check out the show's new website, dreamlandpodcast.weebly.com. If you're enjoying the show, please help it grow by subscribing, rating, reviewing, and sharing this episode with friends, family, and social media. Tonight, my guest is Stan Gordon. Stan has been researching and investigating UFO and cryptozoological cases since 1959. During this time, he's been at the forefront of many big-time cases, such as the Kecksburg UFO crash and the massive 1973 UFO-Bigfoot wave in Pennsylvania. Stan is the producer of the award-winning UFO documentary Kecksburg The Untold Story and the author of 3 books, Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Casebook, Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, and Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures. So without further ado, grab your blankets, turn down the lights, get comfy, and let's fade away into
Dreamland.
Hello?
Hello, may I speak with Stan, please?
You've got him. How you doing, Ken?
Hey, I'm great. How are you?
Good. We're doing good. Your audio sounds real good.
Thank you. So you don't sound too bad yourself. So yeah, I'm excited to talk with you, man, and pick your brain about all the cool stuff. And you've been at this for a long time, haven't you?
Well, this year's only 62 years this year.
Well, that isn't very long. I must have my notes wrong.
There you go. It's been a long, interesting journey, but and what a lot of people find fascinating is I've never personally seen a UFO or a Bigfoot.
Really? That's
correct.
That is.
I've seen a lot of evidence in the field investigating, but I've never personally seen one, even though I believe I was pretty close to a Bigfoot in 73 with a massive wave, and I believe I chased one through a cornfield in the dark that night, but I never got to see it.
Wow, that's a crazy story. Let's hear about that. I want to hear about that. Well, first of all, what got you started in all this? I know the story, but I know my audience probably doesn't, and they'd be really interested in hearing. What got you started in all this?
Well, I was a curious young kid. I was interested in science and electronics when I was very young. And 1959, my parents had given me as a gift, they had given me an AM radio. And so it would have been around the Halloween season, and I was tuning around the radio dial that evening, and there was a radio show talking about strange happenings, flying saucers and strange creatures and haunted houses and all this unusual stuff. And I was listening, and I wanted to find out if these people were making these stories up or telling the truth. So I began to make a lot of trips to the local library and began reading all the books they had on the subject. And as time went on, I started cutting newspaper stories out and made scrapbooks. And I was 16 years old in 1965 when the incident happened near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. And I've been out in the field ever since investigating UFOs and Bigfoot and other phenomena. So that's how it all began for me. In 1969, I set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings. But as word got out, people are calling in about anything unusual from Bigfoot and strange footprints and weird noises and ghosts and anything unusual. They were calling me about it, and it became obvious very quickly that this was a lot more than I could handle on my own. So I decided I was going to try to organize a research group to investigate reports. So in 1970, I found the first of 3 groups that would investigate incidents in Pennsylvania. And the first group, which again started in 1970, it was the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group. And the group and the groups later came, most of the people involved were specialists. We all did this voluntarily. We all had our own full-time jobs, but we had scientists and engineers and technicians and police officers and former military people. And we had a lot of people with specialized backgrounds who were volunteering their time to go out day and night to investigate these reports. And by 1973, we had extended to cover the whole state of Pennsylvania. And to our surprise, we were beginning to get a lot of referrals from the news media, from law enforcement. And so we were just constantly getting reports coming in. And we were lucky we did, because 1973 comes around, and here we have the biggest first UFO outbreak ever documented. And then we had the biggest Bigfoot outbreak in the summer of that year. And I'm sure we can talk more about that later on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know the Kecksburg case really got you going and got you excited about everything. And that's one of my favorite cases as well. I've been across the Chestnut Ridge quite a few times, keeping my eyes open, and been to Kecksburg quite a few times. It's a pretty cool little town there. And that's a really fascinating story. So what was going through your head whenever you were listening to all that going down and finding out what was going on with it?
I mean, we could sit here and talk for literally days about the Kecksburg case, and even though it was so many years ago, you still get little tidbits. In fact, just coincidentally, a couple hours ago, a friend of mine called me and said that there was a person just happened to come to visit their home about something else, and he happened to have a Kecksburg T-shirt on, and this person said, well, I knew a person who was involved in this thing at the time, but he would never go public. He's passed away now, but he would never go public, and that's something you still hear about. I mean, I've tracked down hundreds of people who were involved, but I also know over many, many years that there were other local residents and other people around the area who I know were involved, or knew people were involved, but they never came public for whatever reason. But I remember that evening very well. It was December night, 1965, and it's breaking on Pittsburgh area news on radio and then later on TV that this brilliant fire object was seen from Ontario, Canada, over to Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. At about 4:47 p.m., as it's getting dark in the Pittsburgh area, this fiery object comes in over the greater Pittsburgh area. The radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, police departments, there's jammed with calls coming in. Some people thought it was an aircraft that was on fire. And as the evening went on, reports came in that whatever the object was, that apparently fell into a wooded area near the little village of Kecksburg in Westmoreland County, about 12 miles from where I live. Well, I was not even driving yet. I had no way to get out there. But I remember that evening, I'm running back and forth from when we had the old black and white console TV in the living room and the radio in another room, and I'm running back and forth trying to get the latest reports all evening. And I started documenting everything and writing all the information down as it was breaking on the news. And the next day, I started trying to follow up, talk to people who were involved, but there were so few names out there. But over a period of weeks and months and years, I tracked down hundreds of people who were involved. Some of those involved were people who came out to the scene that night, because as this was being broadcast on the news all over the Pittsburgh area, hundreds of people descended on that small farming community to try to get a look at the object down in the woods. But what I found out later was that, first you had the local residents that saw the object come over, and some of the people saw the object go down in the woods. And I learned that some of those people went down into the woods right after it fell, and they came across this large metallic, kind of an off-gold bronze color, acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. Then you had volunteer firemen coming in, because reports are coming in, and they thought possibly there was a downed aircraft in the area. And then you had the military show up, which was most interesting because so many witnesses, including numerous news people who were there, journalists who were there, reporters who were on the scene, they either saw the military or interacted with them. So they became a part of the story, and they saw the military presence. So what is the military doing there in pretty good numbers with a lot of equipment out there doing in the small farming community here in western Pennsylvania. So it's a very, very intriguing story. There are so many details I've gotten from so many people. The question still remains is what was it? Whatever that object was, we know was moving relatively slowly. It made change in direction along its course, and those who saw it go down that afternoon said it came down almost like it made a controlled landing. It was like they said, like an aircraft on approach to an airport moving quite slowly, but when it fell, some witnesses said there was like a very brief kind of a bluish cloud that went up and then dissipated very quickly. Nobody reported any parachutes at the scene. And whatever the object was, it was quite intact on the ground. And I later found out from independent witnesses, including military source, that this object was taken from the site on a large military flatbed tractor trailer during the early morning hours of December 10th. So the next morning, it has a tarp over top of it. They take it to Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio. It stayed there under very heavy security, I was told. They had a security team that was posted to secure the hangar where they had backed it into. I was told they were given the shoot-to-kill order to anybody who approached the hangar without the proper clearance. It stayed there for a short time, then it continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and that's where it ended up. Where it's at today, we do not know. So it's a very interesting case, regardless of what the object was. There's a lot of interesting details, and I keep an open mind to all possibilities of what it might have been. But regardless, it's a very, very interesting historic account.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story, and I find it funny that everything ends up at Wright-Patterson, doesn't it? At one point or another, as far as UFO military cleanup goes.
Well, and there was a good reason for it back in those days. And even though we have heard of cases where these things allegedly may have locations, Wright-Patterson is something we hear about quite a bit. So you got to remember, during that time period, the Air Force was back then officially investigating UFO sightings. So the Project Blue Book headquarters was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The other thing is, that's also where you had the home of the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force. So that would have been the technical backbone of the Air Force, where anything that was recovered, such as foreign space debris or anything else apparently unusual, would go to Wright-Patterson for analysis. So that'd be a good reason why it would end up at Wright-Patterson.
So I'm sure that many other people have made the correlation, or I don't even know if you'd call it a correlation, the visual correlation, I guess, between the supposed craft and the Nazi bell, because to me those two, they look so much alike. What's your take on that?
Well, there have been many theories since the time it happened of what the object was, and there's many theories. But when you really look at the good information and what we do know, a lot of these things can be probably explained away, and probably not those certain theories. There's been a lot of theories out there, but nobody's come up with any definitive evidence of any of these things right now. And a lot of what we know would just dismiss those theories. But the Nazi bell is something that's been brought up for years. I find it interesting. I am no expert on the case. I've talked to different people over the years that claim to know a lot about it. There are some differences from what I understand. I mean, the physical, the thing a lot of people miss, you see these different graphics of it. You hear people talking about the Nazi bell, which I've never seen any evidence that it became a reality. Yes, apparently they were doing a lot of experimentation with different type of devices back in those days, but I've never seen any evidence that the two are related at this point. But as one witness who unfortunately passed away in recent weeks was a young fireman at the time who was only a few feet away from it, but most of his life he spent as a machinist, and he worked with many type of metals, and he stood only a few feet away from this thing, and until he passed away recently, he always stuck by his story, and he said it looked like somebody took liquid metal and put it into an acorn-shaped mold. So it's one solid, smooth piece of metal.
Wow.
There's no breaks in it. There's no rivets, no seams, no fuselage. It's a lot different than what we hear about with the Nazi bell. In fact, a lot of other type of projectiles that the Soviets and the U.S. were using at the time. And again, this thing is moving relatively slowly. It's making change in direction along its trajectory. It makes a slow descent. It's intact. And what witnesses said, and this fella was a very good witness for the many, many years that I knew him, that he remembered from his memory what he could, but it was so hard to remember exactly what these symbols look like. But on the raised up back of the object, he said these things look more like symbols and writing. And because his background, his family background, was somewhat familiar with Cyrillic, so he knew for sure that's not what it was. And over the years, from his memory, he went and looked up different information on ancient writings and looked somewhat similar to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So again, there's a lot of interesting parts of the story. There's a lot more to this than we have time to even begin to talk about. And it's a fascinating case. And again, I keep an open mind to all possibilities, but I've never seen any evidence so far that the Nazi bell is related to this case.
All right, fair enough. So let's talk about the big flap in 73. Let's talk a little bit about that and your experience with that in the investigation that you did into that, or investigations.
It was an amazing time period, and we had literally hundreds and hundreds of UFO sightings on from January of 73 to the last day of the year. And reports of UFOs all year round on my hotline. But that year was this consistent reports. I wrote a whole book about it called Silent Invasion. And there were so many interesting cases, not just lights in the sky. And of course, one thing I'll tell you right from the beginning, when I started this years ago, and still the same today, because I receive reports pretty constantly, reports always coming in here, even in recent weeks. And a lot of UFO sightings, even though credible sources report it, many are determined to be either natural or man-made in origin. There's a lot of things, especially with UFOs, that are misidentifications. So when you eliminate all those, you still got that body of data that you cannot easily dismiss. And many of those sightings from 73, these were not high-altitude reports. These were large structured objects seen close to the ground. So we had these things hovering over highways, pacing cars, hovering near high-tension power lines. There were landing reports. I mean, it was an amazing time. And back in those days, a lot of the local papers, you had many local neighborhood papers, you had, big town papers, statewide papers, national papers. They were picking these stories up in a lot of cases. Now, not hundreds of them, but they were getting some reports. I mean, even back then, and even, of course, still going on today, many witnesses, whether it's a UFO or Bigfoot, other phenomena, they're very reluctant to publicly talk about it for various reasons. So that was very common back in those days, too. Back then, because there wasn't a lot of places to report to, a lot of people would initially call the news media, the newspapers, or the police to report to see if anybody else had called in. And then we would hear the reports. So you had all those UFO reports, which in itself was just an amazing year. And then in the summer of 73, we had the largest Bigfoot outbreak ever documented. And that went on for weeks and months into 1974. And so many of those Bigfoot sightings, it's not like you see on TV. Many of these were very, very close-range sightings. When I talk about close range, we're talking there were incidents where humans were 5, 10, 15 feet away from some of these creatures. Many of the sightings were in daylight. In some cases, you had more than 1 or 3 creatures seen together at the same time and place. And in a lot of cases, my teams would get to some of these locations within minutes to hours after the incident happened, and there'd be physical evidence on the ground. And for example, there'd be trails of footprints, which we made many casts of during that time period. So it was an amazing time. But that's also when I began to see some very unusual aspects of the Bigfoot phenomena that I wasn't expecting. Because when I got involved in this so many years ago, 1959, then out in the field since 1965, I mean, I was aware of the history of Bigfoot sightings around the country, but also in Pennsylvania. Because in Pennsylvania, there's numerous newspaper accounts going back in hundreds to talk about the wild man of the woods. They didn't call it Bigfoot back in those days. You have the Native American accounts. And so there were sightings for years and years. I had always felt that Bigfoot was very likely some type of unknown animal. But as these reports are coming in from widespread areas, and there's no way these people could have known each other, some very odd things began to show up. One of the first things was our teams had got to some of these locations, and there'd be trails of footprints, large tracks, big 4 to 5 foot strides between the tracks in some cases, in all kind of ground conditions, even later in snow. And as you followed these tracks, in some instances, they would abruptly just stop, and they were gone, where there should have been more tracks, which made absolutely no sense. And by the way, that's still ongoing even in recent years. And that was one thing was odd. And then other really reports began to come in. And some people would report seeing a Bigfoot in daylight standing at a certain location, and they would physically vanish and disappear and reappear somewhere else close by. And then we had one call from a police officer called me from out there around area Latrobe area, Dairy area, along the Chestnut Ridge, which I'm sure you'll hear me talk about, is one of the mountain ranges out here where we have reports year after year of all kind of phenomena, from UFOs to Bigfoot to cryptids. That's been going for years and years. But the police officer called me and said that this man had contacted them, seemed very, very sincere. He and his wife were taking a just nice leisurely drive that afternoon, a scenic area. And anyhow, he told the officer, he said, I know you're not going to believe me. He said, but I'm riding down the road, and this huge, hairy creature walks out on the road. He said, I slowed down, but I couldn't stop in time, and I hit it. And the moment I hit it, it just vanished and disappeared, but there was no damage to the vehicle.
Mm.
So we began to wonder, like, what is going on? And then things got very interesting. We began to see a pattern. We'd have a UFO sighting in a particular area. Within minutes, hours, and days later, we have a Bigfoot sighting or vice versa. And as we get into some of this, some of these reports I think you'll probably want to talk about, I am not suggesting that Bigfoot is a pilot or a passenger in a spacecraft from another planet. Because once again, I said years ago, there may indeed be more than one origin to the unknown category of the UFO phenomena. Because I don't think anybody knows, including the government. I think they know a lot more than telling us, but they don't have the answers themselves, which is one of the reasons there's so much secrecy. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and nobody can do anything about it. It's been going on for years and years. But anyhow, we began to have some really fascinating cases. One of the things that came to our attention was, this would be in September, north of Pittsburgh, 2 witnesses were outside in the country waiting for a friend to pick them up when they see this 7-8 foot tall, white, hairy Bigfoot running across the road towards the woods, but in one of its hands is carrying a small, luminous ball of light. And a short time later, this object comes across the sky and projects a beam of light down into the woods where the creature ran into. And then things got even stranger and stranger. So I'll get back to you now if you have any questions.
Oh, no, I'm good. I know I've talked to plenty of Bigfoot and UFO researchers. The UFO researchers are more open to Bigfoot being correlated with it, and not so much the Bigfoot researchers. They almost all of them they're pretty staunch on it being a flesh and blood creature, but I don't believe so. I think that. And I think the reason why they're saying that is because they're getting physical evidence, but you could have phenomena that gives you, even paranormal phenomena that gives you physical evidence. Doesn't necessarily mean it's flesh and blood,
Right. Well, I as we go on, I'll tell you about just an example of some of the, I've interviewed hundreds of Bigfoot witnesses and thousands of UFO witnesses over the years. And there's a lot of this. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours about some of the things that are going on. And, I started writing about this back in the early 70s. And there was a lot more ridicule than there was today. And I was in touch with a lot of people, the well-known names, a lot of well-known names about the Bigfoot and UFO field back in the 70s in the country and out of the country. And I'm writing this information down, and I knew there was a lot of ridicule, but I found out from a lot of these other investigators, they were very much aware of these same kind of cases, and they had the reports. But they said they were reluctant to write it because they were afraid of being laughed at by their fellow researchers, so they weren't going to do it. My position was, I don't have the answers. This is what I'm finding. I'm putting the information out there so we can try to gather more data, trying to find out what's going on. Well, I can tell you in the last several years, there's been a lot more of a change in attitude now. And again, it may well be that you've got a younger generation now of people in UFO and Bigfoot field, and some are more open-minded. But there's some of the old timers around, and they're starting to realize too, there's so many of these reports coming in from around the country. What I wrote about in Pennsylvania, it's been going on around the country, around the world now for years. And one of the things that I got involved with, and I've written about many times, what I call mini UFOs, investigated them since the 1960s. And these are really fascinating because these are not high in the sky. These objects are low to the ground. They come very close to people. They come very close to people's homes. The smallest ones are like large, oversized fireflies. They're about an inch or two in diameter. The more common description, these things are about a foot or two in diameter, generally like a sphere, but not always. There's some other configuration. Some are a little bit bigger, but some of them are solid metallic, and other ones are just bright, luminous light sources of different colors. Well, in more recent years, Bigfoot investigators from around the country here in Pennsylvania, they're reporting seeing these small spheres of light or other strange light phenomena in areas that have a lot of history of Bigfoot encounters. And so it's fascinating. And for example, this would have been in May of 2019. So this is a rural area outside of Pittsburgh. And by the way, something else that's fascinating, because I monitor and I document and keep track of all these reports, we're getting more and more Bigfoot reports and other cruises, by the way. Not in heavy wooded, forested areas that typically you have the reports. We're getting more sightings in more populated areas near larger cities and areas where there's not a lot of woods, which makes it even more fascinating. But here's the case from May of 2019. So this is a wooded area, and this fella just happened to get awake during the early morning hours. He happened to look out his window, and there's a lot of woods out there, but there's a lot of illumination. They have a lot of lighting out behind that area, behind these homes. He sees a small Bigfoot, which we get reports of smaller ones on occasion, about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, covered with dark hair, long hair in the head and back area, walking upright on two legs. The arms are extended down almost to the knees. And he gets a really good look at this thing. And as the creature goes across another area right to the woods, about 3 seconds later, at exactly the position where the creature had entered the woods, he sees a bright sphere of light about 3 to 4 inches in diameter that suddenly appears. And he said it was similar to looking directly in the front of a flashlight, but it's about 4 feet above the ground. The light then moves a short distance for about 3 seconds and vanishes. A few seconds later, the light reappears again about 10 feet away. And that small sphere emits a bright beam of light that extends about 10 to 12 feet long, that suddenly the beam goes out and it disappears. But these are the kind of things that are going on that you don't hear about very often. And I'll tell you about some of the amazing cases of 73, which is what changed my perception, because, again, I thought I was looking for an unknown primate until these reports began to come in. And what I'm talking about tonight is just a small example of many other reports that have gone on, again, not only in PA, but around the country and around the world that many people have never heard about.
Stan, everybody knows that those mini UFOs, the balls of light, the things that everybody knows those are swamp gas. I mean, that's the best. It's the best explanation. I'm being a smart ass, Stan, because that's the worst. They always give the worst. I don't know, the worst. I guess excuses for what things could be, like swamp gas, and it drives me nuts. But either way, yeah, I would definitely like to hear some of the encounters of 73 for sure.
Well, before we get into that, talking about these mini UFOs, what's so intriguing about them is I have incidents where these things come right up to people in daylight. They're close enough people could reach out and touch them. I have incidents where they pace cars. I've had them enter people's vehicles while they're moving through open windows. I've had them enter people's homes and float around and go back out and go right through right through the walls of the house. And sometimes they'll hover right in front of people's windows of their homes and tap on the window sometimes.
Wow.
And just amazing reports. And a lot of these are daylight sightings at very close range. One of my research associates, Jim Brown up in Fayette County, which again has a lot of sightings, is very active with activity. I think it was like 2 years ago in daylight, report this fella is coming down the road on his way home. And this was in November of 2019. And as he's coming over top of this rise in the hill, as he's passing down this narrow road, he sees this ball blocking the road ahead of him. And he can't understand what this thing is. I mean, it doesn't look right. And he knows he has to move it to go past. So he gets out of his car, and he said this thing was about 2 feet across in size. He sat there for a minute and looked at it. Then he got up. And as soon as he got up and shut the door, I believe he opened the door and started to approach it. It began to physically fade away, vanish, and disappear, and it was gone.
Wow. I'll tell you, like I said, I used to live in Ohio, and the atmosphere up around the Great Lakes is a different type of atmosphere than it is down here. And especially on the Chestnut Ridge, it feels different. Like the energy feels different there to me. What do you think it is about that area that is just so rich with all of this phenomena?
Okay, well, I'll go back to 73 stuff after I answer this question. The Chestnut Ridge, for people who don't know, it's not one small area. Chestnut Ridge is a mountain range that extends about 100 miles long, maybe a little less. It goes through Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County in southwest Pennsylvania, extends down a few miles outside of Morgantown, West Virginia, to Preston County, West Virginia. For years and years and years, there have been reports of all kind of phenomena along the ridge, and it continues to be every year, including this year. And it's an amazing area, but the area, especially on the Westmoreland and Fayette County side, is just very, very active with all kind of reports and sightings year after year. Especially around Derry, outside of Lake Trove, there's been Bigfoot sightings, many, many sightings, cryptid reports. We've had thunderbirds. Last year we had several daylight. There have been Black Panther sightings around that general area and other areas, all kind of other phenomena. It's just an amazing area. So I've spent many days and nights over the years up in that area with my teams investigating, and we've never been able to figure out why there's so much activity. I began to realize years and years ago that while you can have sightings anywhere, people on occasion they have a Bigfoot riding out from their car, they have a UFO hovering in the sky. It can happen almost anywhere, but it seems as though the more data that I have, the more I'm learning from around the country from other researchers over the years, is that sometimes this phenomena, whatever we're dealing with, it seems to focus on or target particular geographical locations or even families for whatever reason. And sometimes there's a long history of these things going on. In other cases, stuff happens, and then for a period of days, weeks, months, or years, all kind of things go on. From paranormal experiences, small balls of light, to UFOs, to Bigfoot, to cryptids, to footprints, to weird sounds. And this is what goes on. There's certain areas where this activity is very prevalent for whatever reason. And so it's a very interesting phenomenon, whatever we're dealing with.
Yeah, it is, man. And you know, that's part of it. Like, I hear all these people talk about, you know, disclosure, and they want disclosure, and I don't want disclosure, Stan, because it'll take away half the fun for me. Like, you know,
well, I don't think you're gonna have to worry about it, because I really don't think, unless some major, huge incident occurs, that it can't be covered up, that's documented very quickly. I don't think it's going to happen. And again, I mentioned earlier, my feeling has been for a long, long time is the government knows a lot more than they're telling us. They do not have the answers themselves. I think just from some indications of what's been coming out over the last few years that they may well be aware that there's a lot more of this phenomena, as I've been mentioning, and that I think for a lack of a better term, we're dealing with something that's interdimensional. And again, there may be more than one origin. Maybe a small percentage of these are extraterrestrial. But there are many incidents of UFOs that just suddenly appear. They sometimes physically change form, even in daylight. Sometimes you go what appear to be solid objects that begin to fade away and vanish and disappear, or they change from one form into another. And then sometimes we have these what appear to be solid objects, like big triangles going across the sky, but they're transparent. You can see through them. And in other cases, in more recent years, even in daylight, you have these objects that go into clouds, but they never come back out. There's a lot more to this phenomena than any of us understand. And whatever the technology is, it's far beyond our present scientific understanding. And I think the more we know about a lot of the Bigfoot phenomena and the cryptids, and I'll tell you some of these stories here in a minute or two, that we're dealing with something that has a physical and a non-physical component to it, and it's far beyond our understanding to figure out what's going on right now.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything that you just said. I mean, I totally do. I don't think that Bigfoot's flesh and blood like everybody thinks it is. And I think that sometimes researchers want it to be so bad that they actually cover up some of the weirder things that happen with these investigations that they do. Actually was talking with Joshua Cutchin about that. I think that there's quite a few researchers out there that withhold information just to, so it goes along with their narrative, you know?
Exactly. And of course, Joshua and Timothy, I mean, their books are excellent. And, you know, if you look at what they've written, there have been several other books in the last few years, some other researchers coming out with similar information. A lot of what wrote about over the years, going back to the 70s, is exactly what they're talking about now. It's getting a lot more credibility. You got more and more people in the Bigfoot field around the country, around the world, are reporting this phenomena. It's not just one or two reports. There's multitudes of cases, and we don't even know how many cases, just like with the ongoing UFO reports. We don't know for sure how much is going on because there's no one place that has all access to all the information. And there's a lot more of this phenomena going on, people realize. Believe me, I deal with these cases almost every day from current and past reports, and these things are ongoing all year round. I get reports in here all year round under all type of weather conditions. My hotline, again, it's been open since 1969. It never stops ringing with calls, and between that and email reports, there's a lot going on. And I can't even imagine how much is going on out there that we don't hear about.
Yeah, me either. All right, well, hey, let's get into the 1973. I'm itching. I need to get into that 1973 because I know there's some good stories in there.
Well, there's a lot of reports, and I'll just go over some of the basic details because we can spend hours just on this one case alone I'll tell you about right now. October 25th, 1973, this is in Fayette County outside of Uniontown, a rural area. There have been a number of UFO reports coming on my hotline during that 24-hour period of that day, October 25th. At 10:30 that night, I get a call from a state trooper from the Uniontown barracks. He had just come back from investigating this incident, and he told me that he felt it was possible there was something still up in the pasture. He wanted to know if I could get a team up there as soon as possible. And we did. It took us a while. It was already late at night. We had to get our people together and our equipment checked out and our equipment together, and we found our way up there, and we were up there during the early morning hours. And what I found out was that you had about 15 witnesses around 9 o'clock that evening that observed this huge barn-sized red ball about 100 feet off the ground, hovering and beginning to move downward. And I have to focus the story on the farmer's son, who was the older one of this trio I'll tell you about. He was coming out to visit his family, and he sees the people standing outside watching this thing in the sky, and he sees it. So he goes to a better location to get a better view, and he and two young neighbor boys are watching this thing. It looks like it's going to land on his dad's farm. So they decide they want to go figure out what this thing is, so they decide they're going to go up there. Before they went up there, he stopped over his dad's farm, grabbed a 30-06 and a handful of ammunition. In that ammunition, he didn't realize later, he had 2 tracer bullets. So you just have that luminous trail that shows the trajectory of where it's moving. And as they're going closer down the road towards the pasture area, dogs around the area are barking and going crazy. They hear this high-pitched whining noise and these baby crying sounds. And they finally get to the area of the field, and they start walking uphill to get to the pasture. And when they get up there, they're standing there, and they're walking across the field, and they can't believe what they're seeing. This object now is on the ground, landed or right above it. But it's not a complete sphere. It's like a half a sphere now. It's a big white dome. And it's about 100 feet or more in diameter, so it's big. And it's illuminating the whole area, making this loud, whining, whirling sound. So anyhow, they're standing there like trying to figure out what is this thing. And as they're watching it, their attention is drawn about 75 feet away there's a barbed wire fence. And along the barbed wire fence are these two huge, tall, hair-covered creatures that are bipedal. The one in the front is about 8 feet tall. The one behind is about 7 feet tall. They're moving very slowly and stiffly from one post to another. These things have no neck. The arms are so long hanging down almost to the ground. They're moving upright. They have large, luminous, green, glowing eyes and are making that baby crying, whining noise. And that one young kid is so scared he runs out of the field. And at that point, the other young fellow is yelling to the older guy, shoot him, shoot him. He takes his first shot, which is a tracer. He fires over their head. He shoots at the tracer. He fires the second tracer. And when he does, the largest of the two creatures reaches out as though to grab it, makes this loud whining, crying noise, and at that moment, that large luminous object suddenly vanishes and disappears. So it doesn't rise from the ground and go to the sky. It just vanishes and is gone. So most of the luminosity in the area is now gone, and the loud whirling sound has stopped. And the creatures turn around and start slowly walking back along the barbed wire fence towards the woods. At that point, he's firing live ammo from his 30-06 into the creatures, and mainly focusing on that big creature. And there was no effect on them whatsoever. So these two guys, young guy and the older fellow, they run back to the truck, go to the farmhouse, tell the family what happened, take to a neighbor and call the state police. So the troop arrives about 45 minutes later. They go up in the troop car. They're looking around for evidence. And the trooper told me, he said the area where the object was on the ground was self-luminescent and glowing. He said about 100 feet or more in diameter. He said he shined his flashlight beam into it. You could barely see it. He said the farm animals wouldn't go anywhere near it. And he said if he had a newspaper, he was certain he could read the newspaper from the light coming off the glow, which extended up about a foot off the ground.
Wow.
Again, there's a lot more to this story. I wrote this whole story up in much more detail, and it gets weirder and weirder in my Silent Invasion book. But anyhow, what happened was they ended up going back to the barracks, and I was told both the trooper and the witness had taken two separate rooms, just separately interviewed, and then they called my team up to investigate the report. And if that was the case, it convinced my team and I that whatever we're dealing with is much more involved than an unknown creature. We're dealing with something we've never, ever thought really got involved or really thought in detail about before. And more reports kept going on in the weeks to follow from widespread areas that are very strange. But it was an incident that happened in February of 74. That was the case that convinced me, again, among others that are similar, that we're dealing with something that is not a completely physical animal. It's something much more unusual. And that occurred near Ohiopyle, which a lot of people heard about. It's a pretty popular tourist area, way deep in the mountains of Fayette County. And back at that time, on that date, some of your listeners who were around back then will remember there was a big national trucker strike. There was gas rationing. A lot of people remember that. There was a lot of violence on the highways around the country. So here in PA, the state police and the National Guard were patrolling together. So some of these fellows from both teams responded to this case. But what I found out was that this woman who lived out in the mountains all her life, she had this nice little cabin home deep in the mountains. She knew animals very well. She was a very good shot. And she was sitting there that evening, just watching TV like a normal evening, when she heard this noise on her front porch. She had some empty pop cans out there, and the pop cans are rattling like someone's knocking them around. And her first thought was that a few weeks before, there was a pack of wild dogs that come through, figured the dogs were back, so she thought, I'll grab my shotgun, and I'll fire over their head and just scare those dogs away. So she gets up and grabs a 16-gauge double-barrel shotgun, loads one chamber, walks up to the front of the door, opens the door, turns on the switch, and steps out. And there's no dogs there, but only about 6 feet away from her is this 7-foot-tall, air-covered creature that put its arm straight up over its head as soon as she turned the light on. She thought it was going to jump at her. And so what did she do? She pulls the trigger, and she said there's this bright flash of light, like the strobe on the camera, and that huge hairy creature physically vanishes and disappears.
Oh.
But that's not the end of the story. Her in-laws lived 100 feet away, and they hear the gunshot. So they call her on the phone, ask what happened. She tried to explain to him. Her son-in-law grabs his pistol, starts walking up that dark road. As he got closer, he said he's surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire. Started shooting at them, ran into the house, and a short time later, they see this large, luminous object, like a big Christmas ornament, hovering over the woods at the same time. That's when they called the state police. And I couldn't get up to the scene that night because I couldn't get gas. I got there early the next morning with our team, and but I talked to the primary police investigator, and he said by the time they found the place way up in the mountains, whatever was there was gone, but he said something very strange happened there that he based on the animal reactions. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you earlier or not, but I've been doing this research now for 62 years. I have never personally seen a UFO or a Bigfoot, surprising to most people. And but anyhow, one thing I have seen, I saw the animal reactions many times. And I always said, you can fool people, you can't fool the animals. And very commonly, when these creatures are near even the most vicious dogs, the dogs are just like paralyzed in fear. They don't bark, they shake, they cower, they hide. And it's really interesting. And so quite often people say how all of a sudden things get really, really quiet when these things show up in the area. I've had many hunters and outdoorsmen tell me that as well. But anyhow, the trooper told me, he said when they got on the scene, they had several big dogs. Dogs didn't make a sound. They had other animals there. They were acting very strange, not doing what they normally do. I remember he told me there was one big dog in a cage that wasn't making a sound. He opened it up, tried to pull the dog out. The dog didn't even move. The dog should have ripped his arm off. The next morning when I got there early, all the dogs were barking back to normal.
Wow.
And but that was the case, among others, that convinced me we're dealing with something that's both physical and non-physical, which is why there's no bodies.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that 100%. So you mentioned the dogs, and I hear you mention eyes a lot. How many cases do you have where people report different colored glowing eyes and things like that?
Many. I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but I can tell you, in some cases, the eyes are just dark. There's no glow whatsoever. But in many other cases, very significant reports. And again, we're talking cases where people were within 5, 10, 15 feet away from these things. Motorists where these things, were very close. I mean, I had one case several years ago, and I mean, this witness was very credible, and this creature was on the side of the road. It's a rainy night. He's riding down this dark road, and this huge 7-foot-tall creature literally steps out on the road. I mean, literally 5 feet in front of him. Just stands there with the glowing red eyes just staring right into his face. And I mean, I was there we were down the next day, and we interviewed this guy. He was he was just shaking, very, very shook up, gave us great detail of this thing from head to toe. There'd been a history of sightings in that area for years. And then even stranger, I've had incidents where people, again, were very close. Some of these were experienced outdoorsmen where here you have this Bigfoot creature with the glowing red eyes. So they're not always red, bright orange red, bright orange, bright green, yellow have all been reported. But I had cases where this thing would turn its head and the brilliant luminosity would change from a bright red to a green as it turned its head.
So what other similarities have you found in these Bigfoot and UFO cases?
Well, it's not just Bigfoot UFO cases. I mean, there's a lot with even other cryptid cases, and even out of place animals. The Black Panther phenomenon is very interesting. I've written several books now, and I'm working on a new one, which hopefully I'll have out in a month or so, and I'll go into detail about some really, really strange cases, some even more recent years. And one of the things that I cover are the Black Panther reports, and they're interesting. And of course, when we think about Black Panther sightings, you're generally thinking about a black leopard, a black jaguar, not common in this part of the country, or many other parts of the country and the world where they aren't supposed to be. But I began to notice different patterns of some of these different cryptids, and one of them was Black Panthers. And I told you earlier about this. Sometimes this phenomena, whatever we're dealing with, seems to focus and target a certain area. And when it does, you see, and they have something opens the floodgate, and all kind of weird things begin to happen. So sometimes you have not only UFOs and screams and footprints and paranormal stuff, but you have sometimes more than one cryptid showing up. And in some cases, when you have a Bigfoot sighting, you get outbreaks of Black Panther sightings as well. And so that's very, very intriguing. And there have been incidents where Bigfoot has been seen side by side with other cryptids, which you hardly ever hear about or hardly ever discuss. And but I had one amazing Black Panther sighting. And again, it was another indication we're dealing with something much different than just an unknown animal that's out of place. And this happened back in February, I believe it was 1983. This would have been, again, in a very wooded, mountainous area. I interviewed the guy after it happened. And so what happened was, it's February of 83. It's a cold morning. The guy was visiting friends, came home, and his car's overheating. Pulls into the driveway about 1 o'clock in the morning, and he goes in the garage and grabs a can of antifreeze. He comes out and he starts putting the antifreeze in the car. He has this growl. And he turns around to look, and about 20 feet away is this large black cat that's growling at him. And he didn't think too much of it. There's cats out there. And he goes back to work, and a short time later, seconds later, here's the second growl, but this time the growl is much louder. And he turns around to look, and he can't believe it. He's in shock, because he said this large house cat he had just looked at has now physically grown about another foot in size.
Wow.
He throws the empty antifreeze jug at it, and he hit it, and the thing growled at him fiercely and took a couple steps back, started walking up the street, which was well illuminated. He runs into his garage, comes back out, grabs his pistol. When he comes back out and he looks, now this large house cat looks like a full-size black jaguar, black leopard, black panther, like you see in a zoo, with a long tail. It has luminous yellow eyes, and it's growling at him. He took one shot at it. He wasn't sure if he hit it, but moments later, it physically vanished and disappeared right in front of him.
Wow, that is bizarre. That's a really cool story.
And there's many. I have so many accounts of different things like this, and I'm not the only one. And you had mentioned you had talked to Joshua, and his book is full of similar accounts. So are others. These things are going to. I said years and years ago, the phenomenon is so strange it protects itself. Because in most cases, unless you have had the experience yourself, it's really hard to believe that you're seeing what you're seeing. And a lot of people call in because they just want confirmation that did anybody else ever see this? Have they heard this type of thing? And they're surprised when they learn they're not the only ones.
And then you have the others that don't call in because they're afraid to be ridiculed, or they just don't believe what they saw themselves,
Yeah, I mean, that's happened in recent weeks and months. I mean, we've had several Thunderbird sightings, these huge giant flying creatures that came in daylight. I mean, literally glided down within 10 feet of two people on two different parts of the state who didn't know each other, with similar accounts where these huge flying creatures turned its head and made direct eye contact with them. And both of them told me that people close to them, nobody wanted to believe them. People wouldn't believe them, and that had a big effect on them. And that's very common with people who see Bigfoot and other cryptids as well. And that's why so many people want no publicity. And one reason why you hear very little about this in the news, because people don't want to go public.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, you go public with it, and then, they toss you on TV with a bit of weird music and poke fun at you, Well, hey,
go ahead.
Oh, do you get many Dogman reports at all?
I do get them on occasion. And, the Dogman phenomena, you've heard more about this in more recent years. But, as I've written about that 73 outbreak, and again, it's very complicated. That's why for years after it happened, people kept coming to me and they say, you should write a book about it, which took me quite a while years later to do. But it's very, very detailed and goes on a lot of things we don't have time to get into. But one of the things was that while you had many Bigfoot sightings that were your so-called typical Bigfoot, something 6 to 9 feet tall with the long arms covered with long hair, but there were also some other cases where you had creatures that some were like taller and thinner, some were smaller and more muscular. But then I had cases where, people were within feet of this creature. And some of those descriptions were more like a dogman report. And I'll give you one instance. This particular case happened in a very rural area back in 73 again. Early morning hours, this woman was visiting friends out in the country. Well, this house happened to be a very low foundation. I mean, it's low enough that it could easily caught up on the roof. And anyhow, she's visiting, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, she has to go to the restroom. She's in the restroom. She's sitting there. She's directly in front of the window, which is low to the ground. She hears these odd sounds outside, and suddenly this horrific face just rises up and is looking directly at her face to face in the window. And, I mean, she went into great detail, talking about more of a dog-like or a wolf-like face, luminous, glowing reddish-orange eyes, I believe it was, fang-like teeth, got to see the ears, and she was hysterical. She ran out of there screaming. She called, they contacted the state police. The state police connected her to me. A trooper went out and found some possible footprints around there. But here's the interesting part of the story, and this is something, again, that a lot of people never heard about. It is not that common, but I've had other reports. She was so scared, she made those people take her to her home several miles away. Within the hour, the same or a similar creature showed up at her house.
Wow.
And I've had other instances like that as well.
How many times do you get those reports where people, see it again, reoccurring?
Not that common. I mean, yes, I've had cases where people, that I've had hunters over the years, they've seen them more than once. But in that type of case where, it's within a short time after the initial case, there's very few that I'm aware of, but it's happened.
Now, you've mentioned that you've never seen anything. Do you think that certain people are more susceptible to seeing these things, or do you just think it's completely random?
I think it's both. What I found out is that, one, again, there's many, many people I've talked to who've never had an unusual experience in their entire life, and then suddenly one day, this thing walks out in front of their car. I've had many, many cases like that, and that's with UFOs, Bigfoot, other phenomena as well, and cryptids as well. But also, I started to look years and years ago with some people, and some of these people, one person in particular, I've been in touch with this person now for well over 40-some years. This was she was a little girl at the time that was missing. She had a missing time experience. There was apparently a big search for her. They found her standing in the middle of a field that had been searched over and over again. She had no idea she was missing. But from the time she was little, she had all kinds of experiences with apparitions and ghost type of things. As time went on later in her life, she had Bigfoot encounters, UFO encounters. Her husband then saw them. And then later on, her children and now her grandchildren are having experiences. So, and I'm finding in other cases as well over the years that sometimes it may be something that's hereditary. And a lot of these cases with these people start from the time they were very young, and throughout their lives they had different experiences. And it may well be that certain people have certain abilities that are able to perceive this phenomenon while other people can't. Or could it be that the phenomenon is attracted to them? And I remember cases years and years ago where there was a group of people, and only people, I think, in that group could see this large object they're describing hovering over top of them, and the other people couldn't see it. So you have things like that happen as well.
Yeah, I was talking with Tobias Whalen about that sort of thing. A lot of these cases that he has investigated, he's found out that a lot of times during the sighting or around the sighting, these people have kind of been like in an altered state, either like how you get driving down the road, you kind of go into road hypnosis, that type of thing, not necessarily with drugs or anything like that, but kind of in between sleep or where they're focused on one thing and their mind is somewhere, and then they see this phenomena. It's we could speculate all day on it. The bottom line is nobody really knows, right?
I'm just telling you, there's so many variations and so many aspects of this phenomena. until the pandemic hit around here, I was getting calls to do numerous lectures. And one of the lectures I was doing is called Strange Aspect of the Elusive Bigfoot. And I went into a lot of these things that over the years have been showing up. And there's just amazing things that most people have never heard about with Bigfoot. And I had a really great response because I was given to all kind of groups, and I was amazed at even some of the scientific people who were skeptical in the group, and some of them came up afterwards and said, you know what, that's the only thing that makes any sense, why there's no bodies. And there's more of this in MECI. For example, years and years ago in the 50s and 60s, since then, on occasion, you used to have reports of UFOs that hovered over cars and paced cars, and sometimes when you're hovering nearby, the headlights would go dim, and the motor would start to sputter, and the power would go out in the car. When the object left, the power would come back on. The car would start up again. But what a lot of people never heard of, again, it's not that common, but it's recorded, and I have cases I investigated where a Bigfoot runs out in front of a car, very near a car, and when the Bigfoot is nearby, the vehicle loses power and the creature runs off and the power comes back on. So you have electromagnetic effects as well when those kind of cases as well.
Yeah, that's crazy. I wonder if they put off something like an infrasound or something like that to that enables it. They'd almost have to, wouldn't they?
Well, the infrasound thing, of course, is interesting in how it affects people. And there's other research I've been doing. It goes much deeper than that. I'm starting to find some really intriguing things, and I'm not ready to go into great detail about it yet, but there's some real fascinating effects that have been showing up over the years. A lot of people are not aware of in some areas where you have a history of some of these phenomena. And it's just amazing. One of the patterns I found many, many years ago was that many low-level, close-range UFO sites, and we're not talking just lights, we're talking large, what appear to be large, solid objects. But then again, we have cases of what appear to be large, solid objects that physically change form and fade away and disappear. So that's even interesting. But we have a lot of sightings of these low-level UFOs, and many encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids occur in the vicinity of energy sources. And I believe this is very important. So you have many sightings around high-tension power lines, power plants, radio communication towers, gas wells, gas lines, bodies of water, railroad tracks, all type of energy sources. And I think there's something very important there.
Yeah, I do too. That's pretty fascinating. Like, I'd like to dig more into that at some point. Are you going to write a book on that?
Well, like I said, I have a new book that's coming out hopefully within the next month or so. And you can keep checking my website, stangordon.info, for information on it. I'm sure it'll be out there. And but there's again, the more I know about the phenomena, the stranger it is. And I'm very glad that there's more and more researchers now around the country who are looking into the same thing. They're beginning to see the same thing. It's not just what I've reported. There's others getting involved in this. Others have cases, and it's much more involved, and there's a lot more to this than most people realize. Yeah,
I agree. And, I think that the way, and by the way, Josh, speaking with Josh, he gives you all the credit for his, where the footprints end and the way that he thinks and does his research. I think it's great because you got to think outside the box on things like this. And, if you're only thinking one way on something that, really there's no answers of or no answers to, then I don't think you're thinking right at all, Well,
again, I think it's important for researchers to look into all aspects of whatever you're dealing with. And, again, have there been hoaxes? Sure there have. Have there been misidentifications? Sure, with cryptids and Bigfoot and UFOs. But there's really good data, and you have such similarities. When you talk to witnesses over the years who don't know each other, years and years apart, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, and they tell you these little details. And that's what I look for. Look for these little details and the similarities, and it's amazing. Something I just briefly mentioned in my Silent Invasion book about 73 was the fact that some of the witnesses were talking about when they're seeing Bigfoot in those areas that they're hearing these strange metal sounds, like metal tearing, a metallic sound. And just in recent years now, you're hearing this from other researchers too and other witnesses more and more. And again, it's not just Bigfoot, other cryptid cases too. They're talking about this odd metallic sound, and how that relates to it, I don't know at this point.
Yeah, I just spoke with a lady the other night who has had several Bigfoot encounters and possibly a dogman encounter. But she said, you know, Ken, the oddest thing, whenever I saw this Bigfoot, I heard this metallic noise. It sounded like machinery moving under me. And I was like, whoa, like, because Josh had told me a story as well about that. And yeah, it's fascinating. Like you're mentioning that because, like I said, I just spoke with her about it. And yeah, it's pretty neat. Like that's a pretty strange piece of the puzzle here, I think.
Well, I don't know how your show is set up, but, you know, if you're able to, some of the shows they do, you can get more than one guest on. It'd be interesting to have Josh and I on together and compare information and case. I bet that'd be very fascinating.
I would love to do that. If you're willing to do that, I will set it up.
Well, I'd be more. I've never, you know, I have talked to Tim and I've met Tim, but I've never talked to Josh, and I think we would have a lot of information to bring out to the public and people talk about these incidents.
I agree. Let's do it. We'll make it happen, Stan.
Schedule sometime in the future and try to get that set up.
All right, let's do it. How many books have you written?
I've written 3 books. Well, I've written 3 books, and I produced a documentary film years ago on the Kecksburg UFO crash. And they're still available out there on DVD. It's called Kecksburg The Untold Story. And my 3 books, my first book is called Really Mysterious Pennsylvania. It's got a lot of detailed case where people are physically very close to UFOs and Bigfoot and other cryptids, so very close range sightings. The it's called Solid Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO-Bigfoot Casebook. It's about that massive wave of 73 and the 74, and we just barely touched on some of those cases. That case from Uniontown, from Fayette County in October 25th, 73, it's one of the weirdest cases ever documented. The whole story's in the book. Multitudes of other stories in there which are just mind-blowing. I got people from all over the world that still call me about that book. The last book I did is called Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures, which has some amazing cryptid cases and UFO cases in it. So they're all available still on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com.
Awesome. Well, Stan, I'm going to cut you loose here. Where can everybody find your information? How can they report a sighting and get a hold of you if they need to?
Okay, the best way is through my website. It's stangordon.info, I-N-F-O. There's phone number and email information on my website. They can contact me directly. And again, the book's available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. And I actually do talk to witnesses that people call me all the time. Awesome.
Well, hey, Stan, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me, taking time out of your busy schedule to do so. It was great, man. I really enjoy listening to your stories and some of your reports and about your investigations. And let's get you and Josh on together sometime.
Okay, that's fine. Just let me know ahead of time. We'll try to get a scheduling set up.
Awesome. Well, hey, Stan, I really appreciate you, man.
All right, and thanks for having me on your program.
Yes, sir. You have a good night.
Night.
Well, that about does it for Dreamland tonight, dreamers. Thanks again for listening, and good night.